Today's daf is daf Chav Zayin, and we're going to begin with the Gemara 5 lines up before the end of daf Chav Vav and Beis. And the Gemara asks the question, Maisa Listar. What is the Gemara's problem? We had a Mishnah on daf of Hay that said that you're allowed to eat an achilas aroi, some sort of temporary fly-by-night snack outside the sukkah. And yet, this Mishnah here on the bottom of Chavav Beis records that when they brought a snack to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the same to Rabbi Gamliel, they insisted that Helum l'sukkah, we have to eat it in the sukkah. So the Gemara answers, there are words that we have to add to the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says the following, according to the new presentation. Im ba lahachmir al atzmo. If he wants to be machmir on himself, then machmir. Well, what does that mean? If he's not fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah with an achilas aroi, then why would a person be motivated to be machmir? And furthermore, if there is such room for chumrah, why does the Mishnah have to record that? I mean, anytime a person wants to take upon himself a chumrah, that's fine. Let it be blessed. What's the chidush here in that Mishnah? So the answer is there are two chidush. One chidush, the Gemara says now explicitly, the lesbe mishum yora. There's a principle called yora, which literally translates as gaiva, and it means that sometimes we have to know exactly what the guidelines are. If you take upon yourself a chumrah, it's not proper, it's not acceptable, it's not, shall we say, a reflection of humility, but rather just the opposite. It's a reflection of conceit. You're building yourself up. Look at me. I have a chumrah, no one else has this chumrah. So under what circumstances do we say that a person's allowed to take upon himself a chumrah? And under what circumstances do we say it's yura? He's not allowed. For example, in our Mishnah, even though you're not obligated to eat this achilas aroi inside the sukkah, nevertheless, it's not yura if you take upon yourself a chumrah. Why isn't it yura? And it seems that yura only applies when your action is pure chumrah, meaning it doesn't have any redeeming value. It is not to be seen within the context of patur, aval yesh bo kiyum. Let me try to explain what I mean. I'll give you the classic example. A woman is exempt from time-bound mitzvahs. If she takes it upon herself to fulfill such a mitzvah, that's not called yura. Why? The Torah says, you know what, women, you're also included in the mitzvah, but we're going to exempt you. We're going to make it easier for you because you have other responsibilities, etc., etc. But certainly if you voluntarily take upon yourself a mitzvah when you're not obligated, you'll have a kiyum mitzvah. Kiyum mitzvah means it's a meaningful mitzvah. You get credited and you will be rewarded. That's not called yur. When a person has what's called a p'tur, he's exempt, although he should be chayiv, but the Torah gave him an exemption. We gave him a little slack, a little room. Then he can take upon himself a chumrah in order to achieve a kiyum and be rewarded for a mitzvah that he's not obligated. In a sense, a voluntary mitzvah should be logically even greater than an obligatory mitzvah. The Gemara says the opposite. The Gemara says, but logically, you would say that if I say to God, look, God, I am so desirable to fulfill your will, I'll do so even if I'm not obligated. That should even be a greater mitzvah. That certainly is not your.
Is that called reshut?
Sometimes it's called reshut, but you never know what the word reshut means. Because sometimes the word reshut refers to like Hataras Nedarim is called reshut. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a reshut, which is a p'tur. I think the real precise language is a p'tur. The Torah alleviated you from your responsibility and your obligation, but really you were included in the mitzvah. But because of your circumstances, the Torah said, you know what, we'll go easy on you. It's not obligatory. Adarab, if you want to come voluntarily and take it upon yourself, that's great. And you'll be rewarded for that.
Say like a chole. Chole is patur.
Correct. And if he would,
pushed himself to do it anyway.
Correct. But let's say it's raining in the sukkah and a person pushes himself to sit in the sukkah when it's raining. That's meaningless. That's not a kiyum mitzvah because the sukkah itself is what's called a dira srucha. It's not Teshu came to dura. So he's stopped doing a crazy action. That's Yura. He wants to show you, oh, look what I'm doing. Like the Gemara tells us about about after the Churban, there was a certain guy, I think his name was Zeira, not the famous Zeira. No, his name was not Zeira. His name was Rabbi something Zeira. I forgot his first name. Anyway, he wore black from head to toe to show how much he's mourning the Migdal, the loss of the Migdal. So the Gemara checked him out. Maybe this is Euro. This is meaningless. With the halacha doesn't require. At that time, the Gemara says they would wear, white socks or whatever they wore. But he was wearing pure black, and the Gemara suspected him of Euro. We'll have in the Gemara, we won't have it because we passed it already, but yesterday's Gemara about Chafei, in the case of a chassan who's potter from Kriyat Shema. So the chassan says, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read Kriyat Shema. I'm above, I can have everything in mind, and that's a real serious issue of Europe. Why? Because the Torah says you're out. Chassan is not chayav in the mitzvah. It's not like a p'tur. The halacha says that a chassan is Torah the mitzvah. That's what he has to be preoccupied. That's what he should be doing. Umaysa nami ve'viu lo l'Rab Yochanan Zakei litom satavshil l'Rab Gamliel shnei kosavos udli shel mayim. And Amru on the top of our daf for today Chav Zayin he'elum l'sukkah. We should eat them in the sukkah. This was a chumrah they accepted upon themselves, not to eat an achilas haroy outside the sukkah.
What are those things?
So they were brought what's called an achilas haroy. Right, 2 dates is called an achilas haroy. Yet they insisted on eating it in the sukkah. Now, this, by the way, again, is a real iyun sugya, because Rava is of the opinion that fruits could never be considered an achilas keva, meaning achilas haroy means that it could be an achilas keva if you ate enough of a volume. But Rava Shita is that fruits, no matter how many fruits you eat from now till doomsday, there's certain diets that they have, just a fruit diet, that's not in the midst of sukkah. So that Rabbi Gamliel here, when he ate these 2 kosovos in the sukkah, he debates, it seems to contradict Rava's principle, because this is not what you'd call an achilas haroy. This doesn't register at all in the sukkah. Just mentioning to you that this is a very important sugya unto itself. So we're here now on the top of Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Shenasna lo Rabbi Tzadok ochel pachos mikibeit. So Rabbi Tzadok was of the opinion that if you eat bread and it's less than the volume of a kibeitza, that's not called an achila. Why? Because in the parasha Birkas Hamazon, the Torah says v'achalta v'savata ubeirachta. And if you eat less than a kibeitza, then it's not v'savata. It's not an achila, which is upgraded to the legal status of an achila. Not only that, Rabbi Tzadok held that if it was less than a kibeitza, then you're not chayiv in netilas yadayim. Nitola b'mapa, he grabbed onto the bread that was less than a kazayis with a cloth, and Rashi says he did that only for hygienic reasons. And thirdly, achlo chutz l'sukkah. He ate it outside the sukkah because he held that this is an achilas haroy, and he's not obligated to eat it in the sukkah. It's less than an achila, which the Torah considers and qualifies as an achila of a kibeitza. And number 4, v'lo birach achrav. He did not recite a birchas hamazon afterwards. Rashi points out that he did recite a bracha rishona, namely hamotzi, because also lehenos min olam hazev lo bracha. We're not allowed to enjoy this world without a bracha. Now the Gemara asks the following. Let's read the testimony here about Rabbi Tzadok very carefully. It says that it was pachos mikibetza, and that's why he ate it outside the sukkah. The implication is, ha kibetza, had he ate a kibetza's volume of bread, then he would be required sukkah. Lema tevi tiyufta the Rav Yosef Abaye. This would seem to contradict both Rav Yosef and Abaye back on Daf Chav Vav, where we learned that according to Rav Yosef, the minimum volume to be chayav in Sukkah is 2 or 3 eggs. You may recall we had a discussion why he says 2 or 3. And Abaye says that it's got to be the amount of bread that a yeshiva student would eat before he went into the shir in the morning, which is 1 beitza. And that 1 beitza, according to Abaye, is considered an achilas haroy. And yet Rabbi Tzadok seems to imply, the way they testified about him, that had it been a kibetza, he would have been obligated in the sukkah. Our answer is Dilma pachos mi kibetza netila ubracha lo boy, ha kibetza boy netila ubracha. The testimony about less than a kibetza was not relevant to sukkah. That was specifically relevant to number 1, netilas yadayim, and number 2, to bracha achrona. And with regard to netilas yadayim and bracha achrona, we require the universal standard definition of achila, which is kibetza. Rabbi Tzadok ate less than a kibetza, therefore he was not chayiv in birkas hamazon nor in netilas yadayim. But as far as sukkah is concerned, there the question is what constitutes a yeshiva of the sukkah. It might be less than an achila, but nevertheless it qualifies as a yeshiva. The Torah commands us shivas yomim teitru b'sukkos. And if the achila has some significance, even if it doesn't meet the high standards of achila, nevertheless, you're chayiv in sukkah. So it comes out now, gentlemen, are you familiar with the Yiddish phrase, svei dinim? Does that mean anything to you? Svei dinim. 2 dinim. That's a phrase that comes from the Soloveitchik's, lineage. Reb Chaim always used to talk about svei dinim. Lubavitch Rebbe also has svei dinim because he came from the Rogatchover. The Roga had dry dinim. The Rogatchover and Reb Chaim Briscoe learned Chavrusa when they were 8 years old together. So Reb Chaim was Machadish svei dinim. And the Rogatchover said, names, drei dinim. What it means is 2 different dimensions of one halacha. For example, what constitutes an achila? So we have 1 din of an achila with regard to birkas hamazon, and another din of achila with regard to sukkah, and they're not equal. It's tzvei dinim. So as far as the shir of sukkah is concerned, if you eat a kibetza of bread, you're chayiv in sukkah, but you're not chayiv with birkas hamazon necessarily, because in birkas hamazon the Torah says v'achalta v'savata uberah. So the svia, the satiation, that upgrades the standard of the requirement for birkas hamazon.
Well,
How are you today? I owe you a telephone. Yeah.
Also need kibetza.
So that's a machlokas tanoim. Our shita here of Rabbi Tzadok reflects the shita of Rabbi Yehuda that you need a kibetza. However, with regard to sukkah, a kibetza is not necessarily yeshiva b'sukkah. You follow, because the Torah doesn't command you to eat in the sukkah. Nowhere in the Torah does it say shivas yomim tochlu b'sukkos. The Torah says teishru b'sukkos. The achila is a means to achieve yeshiva, and that already puts achila into a different category. So that you have to eat 2 eggs, or maybe 3 eggs, or at least more than 1 egg in order to be chayiv in the midst of sukkah. All right, now we're up to the Mishnah. It should be Wi-Fi. Yeah. You want the number. So do me a favor, just because I don't want to interrupt the shir, open my phone and search for Pfeffer, and that number is your Wi-Fi. I don't know if I have it. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, how many meals does a person have to eat within the 7 days of Sukkot? Now that question is sort of a loaded question, because you can ask me about Shavuos and about Pesach. How many meals do I have to eat during the course of Shavuos, during the course of Pesach? The Torah says, "V'samachta b'chagecha," and that requires that I eat certain number of meals. But there's another dimension here, another tzvei dinim, and that is Sukkos. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer is focused on. Arba'asrei seudos chayev odom lechol b'sukkah. Achas bayom, the achas balayla. Rabbi Eliezer says that during the course of 7 days, you must eat a minimum of 2 sudos daily, one in the daytime and one at night. Otherwise, you have not fulfilled your mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah. As far as your mitzvah of yantif is concerned, perhaps 1 meal a day is enough. Or alternatively, if I want to go even further, maybe during Chol HaMoed, I'm not even required to eat 1 meal with bread. But with regard to Sukkahs, Rabbi Eliezer is going to derive from a pasuk that you have to eat 2 meals in the Sukkah daily during the 7 days. 7 times 2 is 14. The Chachamim omrim, ein l'davar kitzvah. You can't tell me how many meals I have to eat in the Sukkah. It all depends. Whenever I feel ready for a meal, the Torah says I have to eat the meal where? In a Sukkah. But don't tell me how many meals I have to eat on a daily basis. However, there is one meal that even the Chachamim concede is obligatory. Chutz mi leilei yontif rishon shel chag bilvad, the first night of Sukkot, and this is going to be the famous Gzeirat Shavah. If you haven't heard of it, then you'll hear it for the first time today here. 2-2, 2-2, Tesvav, Tesvav. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, why does it say in the Mishnah leilei yontif rishon? The answer is he's addressing even Chutz La'aretz. In Chutz La'aretz, there are 2 first nights, because even the second night has the same status as the first night, and therefore you'd be required, even according to Chachamim, to have a Suda in your Sukkah on the second night in Chutz La'aretz. The Od, furthermore, Omer Rabbi Eliezer, Mishalo Ochal Leil Yontif Rishon, Yashlim Leile Yontif Achron Shel Chag. I'm going to tell you what this means, but it makes no sense. And I have to tell you that up front. If during the days of Sukkot, where he's required, according to Rabbi Eliezer, how many meals? 14 meals. He missed a meal. The next day after Sukkot is called what? Shmini Atzeres. He can make up the meal of Sukkot on Shmini Atzeres. Makes no sense. The Torah tells you on Sukkot to eat a meal where? In the Sukkah, on Shmini Atzeres. Eat it in your house. Rashi says, Pazar Kashav, that one of the unique aspects of Shmini Atzeres is that we take our food out of the Sukkah, we eat it in the house. So how can you tell me that he's eating in the house on Shmini Atzeres and it's a makeup meal for us for a meal that he missed during Sukkot? But anyway, that's what it says. The Gemara is going to analyze this. You cannot make up a meal that you missed. This is what Shlomo Melech meant at the beginning of Sefer Koheles, that a twisted thing cannot be made straight. That which is missing cannot be numbered, meaning replaced. The Gemara asks, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. Why does Rabbi Eliezer require a minimum of 14 meals during the course of Chag HaSukkos? The answer is Teshru Ke'ein Taduru. That the Torah says sit in the Sukkah or dwell in the Sukkah, live in the Sukkah, the same way you would live in your house. Now, during the course of a day meaning 24 hours, how many meals do you eat? I eat 3, but at the time of the Gemara, they only eat 2. And they ate 1 at night and 1 during the day. I'm wondering if, according to Rabbi Eliezer, in our contemporary society, we should require 21 meals during the course of Sukkah. Af Sukkah achas bayom v'achas balayla. So the Gemara immediately asks for Rabbanan. Do the Rabbanan deny the halacha of Teshru came to Duru? We have to live in the Sukkah the same way we live in our house. The Gemara answers, Kid Dira. What does that mean? Live in your house, live in the Sukkah the way you would live comfortably in your house. Ma diri boy achil. If he's living in his house, you're not going to force him to eat a meal. He's full. I don't know if you ever had the experience. You come home at night, you had a big lunch that day, and your wife wants to prepare a beautiful supper, but I'm full.
You're not chayav to eat
You're not chayav to eat everything. You're in the mood. So the same thing should apply to a sukkah. You can't obligate me and force me to eat. If I'm in the mood, I'll eat. I'll do in the sukkah what I would do at my house. Af sukkah nami, boy achli, boy lo achli. So the Gemara immediately asks, wait a second, the Chachamim agreed that on the first night of Sukkot, you're obligated unconditionally to eat in the Sukkah. As I feel Leila Yontif Rishon Nami, we should say the same thing. If he's not in the mood to eat, and in his house he wouldn't have eaten that night, why are you requiring him to eat that in the Sukkah? Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Ben Yod Tzadok. This is the famous K'ser Shava called tutu. The Gemara never uses that term tutu, but yeshivas they call it tutu. Nemar Khan, with regard to Sukkot, the Torah tells us in Parshas Emor, Chamisha Sar, and the Torah tells us Biyom Barishon Bar Basar Yom Chosh Berev Tochel Matzah Sad Yom Echadis. It also says Chamisha Sar. So we have now in two parshios, the Torah uses the term Chamisha Sar to refer to the 15th of the month. In the case of Sukkot, the 15th of Tishrei. In the case of Pesach, the 15th of Nisan. Malahalon, just like over there in the case of Pesach, we're going to prove from a pasuk that Laila Rishona Chova, then on the first night of Pesach, you're absolutely obligated, whether you like it or not, to eat matzah. But for the balance of the Chag of Pesach, even in the morning of Pesach, and certainly the other 6 days of Pesach, Rishus, here's your word Rishus. Now, the Vilna Gaon understood that the word Rishus means that you have a mitzvah if you do it. You're not obligated, but you will get a mitzvah. So people like to quote the Gaon because they eat matzah the whole shiva. So they say, "Oh, every time I eat matzah, I get a mitzvah." But not everybody agrees to the Gaon. Is Afkan Laila Rishon Chova become the Elech Rishus. So the Chachamim of Rabbi Eliezer of the opinion that only on the first night you're obligated by virtue of this Gzeir Shav of Chamisha Sar, and beyond that, it's purely a Rishus. So in Parshas Emor, and we're talking about Chaf Gimel. This is Vayikra Perak Chaf Gimel. It says in Pasuk Lamed Dal, it says B'chamichos Yom LaChodesh Hashvi Hazeh Chag HaSukkos. Then, if we go back earlier in that same parak, in Pasuk Vav it says B'chamichos Yom LaChodesh Hazeh Chag HaMatzos, and we equate the two. And just like in the case of matzah, I'm obligated on the first night. The Gemara is going to derive that immediately from a pasuk. So doing sukkah, I'm obligated to eat a meal in the sukkah on the first night. For hasam minolan. And how do we know that on matzah, after all, in matzah, the Torah says, it doesn't say, that you're obligated to eat matzah. It means chag matzah means you're not allowed to eat chametz. But who says you have to eat matzah? Omakra, but there's a different pasuk. This is a pasuk in Parshas Bo, in Sefer Shmos. We're juggling here two different chumashim, Shmos and Vayikra. And it says in Parshas Bo, but Erev, this evening, meaning the 15th of Nisan, Ochlu matzah. So you're obligated to eat matzah, which is one of the 613 mitzvahs. Akasav Kava'o, over the Torah, has now established the eating of matzah on the first night of Pesach as an obligation. And therefore, on Sukkot as well, the first night is an unconditional obligation.
I don't understand the show. If you have a mitzvah, eat matzah. That's the mitzvah of the day of the chag. But there's nothing in Sukkot that you have to eat that require you to have a sukkah the same way.
Well,
how can you say that
I think
just because it says the Chamisha Asr that's enough?
I think your question, if I could reformulate it, would be in Reb Chaim's terminology that we mentioned earlier, would be the following. On Pesach, I'm chayav in an achila. The Torah says tochlu matzah. On Sukkot, the Torah never obligated me in achila. I have to live in the sukkah. If I live in the sukkah, I go in there and I sleep in the sukkah. Whatever I do in the sukkah, that should be enough. How do you have to eat a meal in the sukkah? That's I think another way of formulating your question. So
like by Pesach, we have a specific word in the Torah that obligates us to matzah.
Right.
Sukkot, it's more of like a mashmaut.
On Sukkot, it's a mitzvah of yeshiva of the Sukkah, which means dwell in the Sukkah. You can dwell in the Sukkah means a million and one things. Yeah, I bring in my, hopefully not my social media, but anyway, I bring in my phone into the Sukkah. I talk to my buddies in the Sukkah. I do a lot of things in the Sukkah. Who says that I need an achila? But I think the answer to this question lies in what I call Hilchas Gzeira Shava. We have to know a lot more about how Gzeira Shava works. And what the Torah is saying is not that you're chayiv in achila on the first night of Sukkot, but you're chayiv in yeshiva. But how do I know what particular dimension or what pa'ula of yeshiva am I obligated in? And for that, the Gzeira Shava tells me that I need an achila, not a, and that we'll soon see there's a havamina that maybe I have to eat matzah on the first night of Sukkot. That's really wrong. And by the way, this is going to touch on a fundamental question about the first night, whether or not you eat in the sukkah if it's raining. Because it could be the Torah is telling you through this Gzeras Hashem, you have a mitzvah achila. And that mitzvah achila requires a kezayas and not a kibetz of many nafkaminas. The Od Omar Rabbi Eliezer. Now the Mishnah tells us that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if you missed one of the 14 meals, you can make it up when, Rabbosai? On Shmini Atzeres. So the Gemara says, V'Omar Rabbi Eliezer, Arba Sudos Chayiv Odom Lechel B'Sukkah, Achas Bayom, V'Achas Balayla. He's got to eat in the Sukkah. On Shmini Atzeres, he's not eating in the Sukkah. By the way, the Some Farshim want to claim that Rabbi Eliezer held that if you miss one of the 14 meals, then the makeup meal on Shmini Atzeres has to be eaten in the sukkah. But again, most of the poskim don't go that way. Amar Bira, Amar Rabbi Ami. From whence did Rabbi Eliezer come to the conclusion that you can make up one of the 14 meals? Chazer bo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer rescinded his original position. And he holds that you don't have to eat 14 meals in the sukkah. He actually accepted the chachamim. This is what you call intellectual honesty. The chachamim convinced him that there's no minimum obligatory number of meals that you have to eat. But what was the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the chachamim? Rabbi Eliezer said that you can make up through a substitute meal on Shmini Atzeres. What meal are you obligated on Sukkot that you can make up on Shmini Atzeres? Well, it's got to be the first night of Sukkot. Because that now, if Rabbi Eliezer agrees to the position of the Chachamim, then the only meal that you're obligated to eat during the course of 7 days of Sukkot is the first night. And if he missed the first night, then he's got to make up that meal by eating a meal on Shmini Atzeres. Again, you'll ask me the question, well, Shmini Atzeres, he's not eating in the sukkah if you don't hold like those shittas. What does it mean that according to Rabbi Eliezer, you can make up the meal? And the answer is the following. This, I'm going to tell you over a summary of the Marshal. You heard of the Marshal? He lived 5 centuries ago. His name was Luria. He says that once Rabbi Eliezer rescinded his original position, and therefore he agreed with the Chachamim that the only single meal that you're obligated is the first night. So then, theoretically, you could eat that one meal even outside the sukkah. Meaning the Marshal is assuming, going back to Reb Chaim that we mentioned earlier, that the mitzvah on the first night, which is an obligation derived from what, Rabbosai? 2:2, is a mitzvah achila. And the only reason I have to eat it in the sukkah is because on sukkahs I can't eat outside the sukkah. But theoretically, I'm allowed to eat that meal outside the sukkah because that meal is derived from matzah. And just like in matzah, I don't have to eat it in the sukkah. So to the first meal of sukkahs, I don't have to eat in the sukkah. Again, for another technical reason, I'll have to bring my meal into the sukkah because of the obligation of sukkah that says you're not allowed to dwell outside the sukkah. But that's not the chiyuv seudah. The chiyuv of the seudah on the first night is a separate chiyuv achila derived from the Gzeira Shava of Tesva. Mashlin b'mai. So now he's adding a meal on Shmini Atzeres. What do you mean adding a meal on Shmini? Shmini Atzeres itself is Yom Tov. Ilema b'riftov, he's adding a meal of bread, is Suda de Yomi Kocha. He's not eating that meal as a makeup to compensate for the meal that he missed on Sukkot. He's eating that meal because of the mitzvah of what? On Shmini Atzeres. So therefore we have to reinterpret Rabbi Eliezer when he says Mashlim. Yashlim b'mini targima. He's got to add something which he normally would not have eaten on Shmini Atzeres. Some sort of a dessert, which is called targima. Targima is like a dessert.
Making up for a meal.
Yeah, in other words, he so to speak completes his meal with bread, and I'm not sure if he has to bench. Let's assume he benches just to make life easier for himself. And then he brings out some very good pastries at the end of the meal. Maybe he'll bring out meat or fish, to make it a significant meal. The Rosh insists it has to be mizonos. That's the Shitas HaRosh. Again, this is all theoretical because we don't accept the Shita Rabbi Eliezer. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, that make-up meal to compensate for the meal that he missed on the first night of Sukkot has to be made up according to the Rosh of mizonos. Tosfos says it could be meat, it could be fish. Rashi holds it could be meaning targima in the classic sense, meaning, sweets, whatever it might be. Now we have a brisa to support this. In Hishlim b'mini targima yatza. Only if he added something beyond the meal, which he's required on Shmini Atzeres in any event. And that's mini the targima, then he was yotze, according to Rabbi Eliezer, as a compensation to replace the original meal. Now, Rabosai, we are pressured for time, but I'd just like to give you food for thought, especially since we're learning about food. This whole sugya of Rabbi Eliezer, called a makeup meal, has to be put in a broader perspective. And that is another Masechet that we're going to learn in Ritz Hashem and Daf Yomi, I suppose, in a couple of months. I haven't calculated. That's called Masechet Chagiga. And in Korban Chagiga, we're going to find there's something called Tashlum. So if you didn't bring the korban on the first day of Yontif, you have the next 6 days to compensate. That's called Tashlum. Secondly, what exactly is the status of Shmini Atzeres? On the one hand, it's a regular B'fnei Atzma, but on the other hand, it's called Shmini. The Torah itself calls it the 8th day. Shmini Atzeres is a hybrid. It lives on its own. It's an independent moed, but on the other hand, it's anyway. I'm just telling you that this Shol Apotropos Shel Agrippas Hamelech Es Rabbi Eliezer, the Heisbacher, the second in command of Agrippas Hamelech, asked Rabbi Eliezer, "Kagonani she'eni rogel lechol el suda achas bayom mahu." Do I have to eat 2 meals a day? This is in the original formulation of Rabbi Eliezer. I only eat 1 meal a day. Admit to me that even though you eat 1 full meal a day, but you certainly, add different kinds of parparos, which are, desserts and delicacies, because that's called kvod atzma. Kvod atzma here means for your own pleasure. The achshav, now it's Sukkot. Iyata mamshich parparos, parperes achas lechvod koncha. Now you're talking about eating not because you have an appetite and you enjoy the food, but in order to fulfill the will of God and honor Hashem on Sukkot, and you're going to get away with 1 meal? Even during the course of the year, you'll eat more than 1 meal. Yeah, he was a Jew.
Ah.
The Od Shalo, and now the Apotropos asked Rabbi Eliezer another question. שיש לי שתי נשים, אחת בטבריה ואחת בציפורי, ויש לי שתי סוכות, אחת בטבריה ואחת בציפורי, מהו שיצא מסוכה לסוכה, in the middle of sukkahs, can I re-establish myself relocate myself from Tveria to Tzipori, ve'poter, and fulfill my obligation? And this question is based on the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer, which we're going to study, that you cannot eat in two different sukkahs during the course of sukkahs. You have to eat in one sukkah. It's got to be a sukkah for all 7 days. But in this case, since I normally, even if it was my own house during the course of the year, I have one house here and another house here, would that be okay for me to eat in two different locations during the course of sukkahs? I built two different sukkahs. Omar lo, that's not acceptable. Ani Omer kol yotzin misukah l'sukkah bitel mitzvasa shel rishonim. As soon as he leaves the first sukkah, he has now negated his mitzvah of sukkah. Anya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer,